There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
From Mamamia, I'm Mia Freedman. You're listening to the No Filter podcast, and I like leaderboards. I honestly find them quite an objective way to understand priorities, like where things fit in order. And if there was a leaderboard of relationships in order of how much society values them, I think we can all agree that romantic relationships would be at the top. Next would be parent-child relationships, and then maybe siblings, and lastly, friendships. Why is that though? Why aren't friendships given more respect? Why aren't they higher on the leaderboard? Think about it. So much of our lives are organised around romantic milestones. First dates, first kisses, first sex, first anniversary, moving in, getting engaged. They're all dots on the map leading towards that ultimate milestone at the top of the leaderboard, marriage. Everywhere you look, our culture tells you that finding a romantic partner is the ultimate achievement in life, and it's the most important relationship you'll ever have. And it's simply understood that all of your other relationships must automatically shuffle down and make room or recede from your life when a significant other enters the picture. But what if your significant other was your friend? Someone you love and prioritise as much as you would a romantic partner, just without the sex. I don't mean in that whole my husband is my best friend kind of way that's become almost compulsory in modern romantic relationships. I mean, what if you had a friendship which was so important to you that it sat at the top of the leaderboard and above every other relationship in your life, including romantic ones? They all came under it. Today you're going to meet someone who has posed a radical question. What if our significant other was a friend? And what if we organised our life around that friendship in the same way as we would a romantic partner? In a moment, you're going to hear about some friends like that. There's Andrew and Tolly, Natasha and Linda, Tilly and Cami. And there's also my guest today, Rhaina Cohen and her friend Em. Rhaina is an author, podcaster and an editor, and she's written a book about this type of friendship that transcends the category of best friend. It's something else entirely. Now, not everyone has experienced a friendship like this, and if you have, it might not have lasted forever. I've experienced a couple of friendships like this, and they haven't lasted. But look, marriages don't last necessarily either, and yet we're expected to always let romantic partners jump the queue and elbow everyone else in our lives out of the way when they show up, right? What if we didn't though? Here's Rhaina Cohen. I want to start with Em and how you met your friend who you refer to as Em in your book. Can you tell me a little bit about where you were at in your life when you met her and how your friendship sort of unfolded?
So I had moved to Washington, D.C., which is where I now live. But at the time that I met Em, I'd only been there for a few months. I had started a new job, my first kind of like real job post-grad school. I had a life, but I also had space, which I think is a really key part of what unfolded, which is Em and I met at a friend of a friend's birthday. You know, you go to anybody's birthday party when you don't know people that well in a city yet. And I spotted Em across the room. And even before getting to talk to her, I kind of had a sense I wanted to talk to this person because of her body language. And when we did talk, we just really clicked and discovered pretty soon after that we lived a 5-minute walk from each other. So we became really integrated into each other's lives. And she hadn't been in DC for that long. She had broken up with someone she'd been in a relationship with not that long before that. So neither of us had really built kind of full flourishing communities yet. And we were able to act essentially as partners to each other. I was also in a romantic relationship, but my now husband was a 6-hour train ride away from me. So we saw each other every other weekend. I still was tending to my romantic relationship, but I wasn't living with him. I had, again, space for other close connections in my life.
You talk about that first night that you and Em met, and it does sound like a meet cute, like the beginning of a relationship, right? And then you kept talking, and then you said Em had no chill. Was she texting you? Were you like, let's see each other the next day? Like, how did things escalate?
I think I also have no chill, but I sometimes am able to hide
Same.
it, or I become like self-conscious about the fact that I have no chill. And then, try not to tell everybody like how excited I am about them. Often this is in a friendship context. And I think like I'm just is not that concerned with what people think in this aspect of life. I think more than texting, she'd sent me voice memos, and I had never gotten voice memos from people before. Even though I work in audio, it's kind of funny. Like I know people's voices are so powerful to hear, but she would just send me these meandering voice memos while she was on a walk. And that was a really major mode of communication for us. And it just was part of my routine. To and from the metro, I would send her a voice memo. We were just both, I think, really hungry to learn about the other person and did not shy away from that fact. But I think it helped actually that we lived near each other, because we had all these excuses for run-ins. We didn't have to schedule like, we are going to plan to see each other 3 times a week after having just met. Like that might sound a little bit extreme, but if we are walking by each other's place anyway, why not stop by? Why not have, a silent reading night together, or, whatever it was. So it was the combination of the excuse from living near each other and then M's willingness to just reach out and not feel like maybe it would seem as over the top. It gave me permission also to do the same.
I often think about some of my most intense friendships, which is pretty common to women, was when I was younger, when I was at school, primary school, high school. And then you do a lot of just hanging out. When you become an adult and you make friends as an adult, or you have friends that you've already got, you have to make a time. It's usually around a meal, really. Like you have dinner together, or you have a drink together, or you have breakfast together. But the real friendships, one of the things that I miss a lot is just that hanging out time where you can both be sort of sitting on your phones, or just, you don't have to have that intensity of the, 90-minute catch up over dinner kind of thing. It sounds like that's what you and Em did a lot of.
We were just able to coexist in each other's lives.
Yeah.
And I've actually, kind of separate from the whole story with the book, like I've written about what adults can learn from kids' friendships. And it's really so much of what you're describing, that there was no agenda when I was a kid and playing outside with my friends or stopping in a common space in college. And that's where you end up like forming a lot of memories.
Yeah.
And what I had with Em and what I had in these earlier relationships that's harder to replicate as an adult is living your life alongside your friends rather than narrating your life after you've done it.
Oh, explain that.
If I haven't seen a friend in a few weeks and we have dinner together, we are catching each other up on the parts of life.
This happened.
Yes. And maybe if you can avoid some of that by keeping in touch via text, voice memo, sending videos, so on. But there's a difference between the catch up versus we're going to go to the grocery store together and we're going to, build further into our routines. Even if it's pretty mundane, there is something that feels different to me about taking action, like doing things that are embodied beyond sitting across a table from each other. And it just feels like you're giving an audible memo to people sometimes. And it can be really rewarding. Like I had an extremely rewarding lunch with a friend I hadn't seen in years. And it was kind of beautiful to reconnect and to see where she was and how much had changed. But it is fundamentally different. And doesn't enable the same kind of closeness as if you are just able to drop by someone's house and coexist. There's a real intimacy to being able to do very little together.
When you think about that time over a period of weeks, months, had you had a friendship like that before, and what did it actually feel like to you?
I'd had glimmers of friendships like this before. I am still close to a friend in grad school and had a very similar kind of meet cute, if you will, where I saw her across the room. She was cross-legged on a chair talking to somebody else and was physically leaning in. I found that very compelling. It felt like it said something about her personality. The first year we were in grad school, we were in the same place and we spent a lot of time together. And then the second year, we were in different parts of the country. So we became like less involved in each other's lives. So I'd had, something like that feeling. I had witnessed it when I was younger and kind of envied what I had seen among people who had had these extraordinarily close friendships, especially these 3 women, I guess they were then girls, who were 2 years older than me. And whatever it is, 15 years later, they are still this very solid, extremely close unit. I think I craved that sort of closeness because I saw it, but I didn't have it in quite that form.
How did it feel different to falling in love?
It didn't feel that different. I mean, that was the thing that I was trying to grapple with. There's a line in my journal where I was like, at the time when this was unfolding, it's like, it feels like the way that I fell in love with my husband. There's not a sexual desire component to it. It's sort of like infatuation and thrill and butterflies or whatever, the kind of desire to know as much as I can about M and to have as much access to her mind and her influence as I can, which I think is something that people will experience in romantic love. But for me, certainly it's not exclusive to it. And so I was trying to wrap my mind around, why is it that I was told that this feeling can only happen within romance? Because I'm experiencing it in friendship right now.
Was it ever on the table, a sexual relationship between the two of you?
No, it just was never there. I mean, in the process of working on the book, I like checked with M and was like, is anything going on in your mind? Just like, don't want to make any assumptions. And she was like, no, I just don't think it was on either of our minds to have like a sexual romantic relationship. We did talk about our friendship as a romantic friendship and having romantic elements. And romantic friendship is a historical term for a very intimate same-sex friendship. We were adopting it for ourselves. So it's not like we shied away from romance, but people conflate, I think, romance with sex. And we sort of distinguish the two, that you can still have that passion and thrill and like just like sweetness, but that doesn't have to come with a sexual desire.
And it can be quite flirty. I mean, I know when I've fallen in love with friends, you can kind of get that banter going that doesn't have to be sexual, but it's almost like the kind of banter that you would have romantically when it was going in a particular direction.
Yeah, I mean, this makes me think of a friend who is queer, and she'll find that it's easier to sort of be flirty in a friendship context sometimes than in a romantic context with women for her. And you can have banter, you can have a form of like flirtation in a friendship setting, but we just don't usually tend to use the same language to apply to the same behaviors if it's happening in friendship rather than romance.
How did your husband, then boyfriend, feel about this? How did you explain M to him? Did he ever feel threatened?
Definitely did not feel threatened. Mostly I'm just sort of smiling to myself because I think he was probably utterly unsurprised because I take strong attachments to people. Like, I mean, you'd asked, like, had I ever felt this way before? I didn't have the kind of level of commitment and involvement in quite the same way. But my husband and I met in grad school very soon after I became friends with the woman who I'd mentioned earlier, who was maybe the closest kind of relationship I'd had to this. So he saw how close the two of us were. I'm a very physically affectionate person with my friends, so he's witnessed that. So I don't think it surprised him that I became so close. And he has his own independent friendship with them. Like the two of them are close. And he is one of the most well-adjusted people I know who doesn't really experience jealousy as an emotion almost ever, even in his professional life, personal life. So I might have also just gotten lucky that for him that wasn't there. And then the other piece of it is that something that drew us together was how much we both had rich friendships in our lives. Like I loved that my husband is still very close to his best friend from college. They have lived on different continents for most of the time that I have known the two of them, and yet they are dedicated to keeping in touch and making sure they see each other. It is a value that we share to be really close to friends, and it then makes sense that it wouldn't be threatening, but instead a value add to him.
There's an image in your book that you talk about walking down the street and you were holding both of their hands, which I just love. Did you ever think of being in a throuple? I don't know how many years ago this was when it sort of was at its peak and whether that was even something in the culture back then, but did you ever think about that?
No, we hadn't. At that point, the only exposure I'd had to non-monogamy, I think, was not super positive, and I think does not capture the other kinds of experiences I've since seen. But M did not fall into a romantic category. Well, I should say the idea of non-monogamy did come up when I talked to a friend of mine who has experience with polyamory and said, you just have two partners, Rhaina. Like one is a romantic partner, one is a platonic partner, you're practicing polyamory, which was interesting and kind of helpful in some way for giving me a framework to think about the relationship and also to say that these relationships were of the same kind. I mean, I think it's just so easy to diminish friendship. And instead of saying this is just a friendship, my friend was saying that this is a partnership. So that was kind of the most relevant way that polyamory came into the picture. I mean, I was always closer to M than my husband was to her. And it wasn't like a what you would call like a V sort of relationship.
A few years ago, you went to a series of weddings and you noticed that they all had something in common. What was it?
It's something that maybe other people have also observed at weddings in the last 10, maybe 20 years, that the couple that's getting married refers to one another as their best friend, often during the vows. Not only that, but often there are friends standing in the background while this is happening. There is a best man, a maid of honor, bridesmaids, groomsmen who are present, who might have previously been considered a best friend, and that baton is being passed or seat is being demoted, however you want to view it.
This idea that your romantic partner should be your best friend, that's pretty recent, isn't it? Because we didn't used to ever have those expectations for our romantic partners.
Very far from it. I mean, marriage 150, 200, many hundreds of years ago was there for pragmatic reasons. People didn't necessarily even have a choice over who their spouse would be, and that's still the case in plenty of parts of the world and plenty of cultures. Now we not only expect to love our spouses, which was its own development in the West, and that's not that long ago, but we also expect them to play an enormous number of roles in our lives, including being our confidant and co-parent and roommate and your professional coach and also best friend. That's just something that people would not have expected in the past.
Puts a lot of pressure on romantic relationships, doesn't it? And it's also a lot of eggs in one basket.
I think my caveat is I think it is a positive development that there is enough equality in a lot of relationships now that it is plausible to describe your spouse as a friend, let alone a best friend. Even 60, 70 years ago, women were property of their husbands in marriages. So kind of hard to be friends with somebody who has ownership over you. So I think the idea that there should be this kind of amicability and reciprocity and equality in a marital relationship, in a romantic relationship, is a good one. But now the expectation is so extreme that your romantic partner is supposed to take the top title in multiple categories, not just be your one and only romantic partner and the number one person in your life, but also the number one friend, which doesn't leave a lot of space for other kinds of relationships in your life.
After the break, Rhaina tells me about some friendship situations that are seen as really unusual, but have actually worked well. And we talk about compulsory coupledom, the way society makes people feel bad, like a failure if you don't have a romantic partner. We'll be right back. We've spoken a lot about female friendship, and I think a lot of people would be familiar with that, the intensity of female friendship. But in the course of writing your book, you spoke to a number of pairs who were what you would call sort of significant other friendships, like a friendship at another level to just best friends or close friends. Two that I was really interested in, they were actually the first pair you spoke to, Andrew and Tolly. Tell me about their friendship.
So they have been best friends since they were in high school, about 15, and now they're in their 30s and have made a lot of the kinds of decisions in their lives that people would expect only romantic partners to make. And they have had to defend those choices to have such a significant role for a friendship in their lives. So some examples of those kinds of decisions would be Andrew was doing a PhD program on the East Coast of the United States. Tolly was already a couple years into a PhD 3,000 miles away, however far away California is from Boston, and switched PhD programs so that he could work with Andrew, and they have lived together since then. It's been quite a few years of living together. They took time away from grad school to start a nonprofit together, again, living with each other. Since graduating, they have taken jobs together and lived together. They ran into issues with romantic partners where they would date women for a few months, and then the women at some point would realize that the friendship was as important as it is and would no longer feel comfortable or like the romantic relationship had enough precedence for their preference. And they, have eventually presented themselves as non-monogamous, not because they want to have multiple romantic partners, but because they think that the only way to find a romantic partner who is okay with somebody else being equal to or maybe even above them in certain kinds of decisions would be people who are okay with the framework of non-monogamy. So they've really been willing to make a lot of sacrifices in order to tend to this relationship that has been a very anchoring, close relationship for their intellectual and emotional development since they were teenagers.
The intensity of these friendships and I guess the permanence and significance of them can be confusing for people around them, right? Or around you. At one point, Andrew's mother was having conversation with him about someone he'd grown up with who was getting married, and she was talking about how she wished there was someone in her son's life who gave him that kind of fulfillment of a romantic partner. And he said, I've already got all that. I've got it with Tolly. And she said, what do you mean? And he described him as a platonic life partner. She said, I don't understand how your life partner can be someone who you aren't romantic with. You write that this friendship and these kinds of friendships defy two widely held beliefs, that a partnership is, by definition, a romantic relationship and includes sex, and that without a long-term romantic relationship, life is incomplete.
I think it is so hard for people to wrap their minds around commitment that is not tethered to sex in some way. I was just talking to a woman yesterday who lives with her husband, their two kids, and then her friends who are a couple and their two kids.
They all live together.
They all live together. They're raising their kids together. And they live in a very liberal city in the US. And she's heard of people asking if they were swingers, as in are these two couples having a sexual relationship, because they can't wrap their heads around why would you buy a house with someone who you're not in a sexual relationship with? It might be that we don't have enough models to make it normal to think about people who are friends doing this. But yeah, I do think that we conflate forms of intimacy and attraction, as we were talking about earlier, so that the kind of commitment that is part of partnership, building a life together, is inextricably bound to romance. And then the other piece of this is a term that I bring up, which is compulsory coupledom, that there is this requirement, essentially, to be in a couple if you want to be viewed as successful and normal. That is something that weighs on single people, weighs on people like those who I write about in the book, who have a very devoted partnership, but it is not a romantic one. And therefore, it doesn't count for all intents and purposes in this requirement to be coupled.
Yeah, this idea that somehow you failed at life if you're not coupled, that's still a pretty pervasive idea in our culture, isn't it?
The recent example of this was I was interviewed by Trevor Noah, who is a comedian in the US and very successful professionally, and he's not married. And we were talking about this, and he said that he is viewed as a loser because he is not married, that he might be successful in all these other ways. But if you are not coupled, you have not contributed to society in some way, or there's something wrong with you. You have to defend yourself. It's a why are you still single line. There's something that there's scrutiny around. There is something that must be wrong with you if you do not organize your life in this way. I think there's a moral judgment that it means that you aren't mature or you're selfish. It is striking to me that even though singleness is so much more common, that people will tell me these sorts of things, that they feel like people treat them as if they have not actually arrived as a full adult in the world.
I'd probably suggest that the Trevor Noahs and the George Clooneys before he married Amal, I don't think they're seen as losers. I think that they're seen as players, probably, men more. But women are seen as unlovable, unwanted, unfulfilled, incomplete. One of the reasons, though, perhaps for this is that we don't have rituals for friendship, for acknowledging milestones in friendships, for celebrating friendships, for commiserating friendships when they end. What are some of the rituals that you discovered that friends have created themselves to mark milestones or levels of commitment?
One person I talked to bought these bracelets that at the time at least were marketed toward couples. They're bond touch bracelets. So the idea was that when you are not in the same place, you could touch your bracelet and it would make a kind of vibration or sensation on the other person's bracelet. So it was a way to stay connected. I've heard people get tattoos. Em and I have matching necklaces, which we celebrate our anniversary of when we met. To men who I've interviewed celebrate their brotherversary. They talk about each other as brothers. I've also interviewed people who have gotten married, not because they are in a romantic relationship, but because they either wanted the status, the kind of recognition that marriage confers, or they wanted the rights that are attached to marriage. And I've, heard about friendship ceremonies, other sorts of things that people have created, and also rituals to grieve if a friend has died. There's something beautiful about these rituals because they are made by the people that they are for. They're not just, it is Valentine's Day, I'm going to get you a dozen roses, I'm going to follow the script ritual. It's something that's very particular, but the downside of making up your own ritual is that it's not something that's recognized by other people. So it's not like a wedding where people understand what it means to marry and they show up with gifts or cards or they're there to support you. So I've seen the double-edged sword of a DIY ritual to commemorate a friendship.
I'm thinking of the most pop cultural illustration of this kind of friendship would probably be Sex and the City.
It felt really sad. No special guy to wish me happy birthday. No goddamn soulmate.
Don't laugh at me, but maybe we could be each other's soulmates. And then we could let men be just these great, nice guys to have fun with.
Or Broad City. And maybe Girls. Those three with different generations of women where friendship is very much at the forefront and romantic partners come and go and they're very much side characters. But at the essence is those friendships.
Broad City, I think, is a really good model, even though they're so out there, of the kind of friendship that I'm writing about because they are obsessive, attached at the hip. They've built their lives around each other in many ways.
Hey, this is Abby. Leave a message. Leave a message.
Dude, I'm going to be so pissed if you're dead. You got to call me back. I'm freaking out.
I actually, think TV has quite a few good examples of friendship being the main driver of the story, but we certainly could use more because the other shows like Friends, it is about friends, but then also the show dissolves when two of the characters, Chandler and Monica, who are married, move to the suburbs. And there's an earlier part of the plot where Monica's best friend has to move out to make space for Chandler.
It's going to happen. Chandler is going to move in here.
We're not going to live together anymore?
No.
Oh my God. I'm going to miss you so much.
I'm going to miss you.
Sometimes these shows about friendship are actually about the friendship and then the romances come in and out. And sometimes the friendship is kind of a backdoor to let the romantic plot in. I'm eager to see more of the former where the friendship is the driver.
Tell me what happens when children arrive, because romantic partners are one thing, but children can disrupt any kind of friendship, really. They're a big disruptor of lives generally, I find. Tell me about Cami and Tilly, who were very close friends. They met in military school, and then Tilly went on to have a couple of kids.
It can go different directions where a friendship recedes because parenting becomes overwhelming and it's hard to plan, or parents and non-parents don't want to spend as much time together. But in Cami's case, her friend Tilly really stepped up to be kind of an additional caregiver to her child. So Cami was a single mother and she had a lot of trouble balancing the needs of, at first, when they were in college together, being able to go to classes. Like any single parent, she was juggling a lot in terms of caregiving. And also she was trying to make an income. She was working at a bar at night and she was going to school. And Tilly just offered to help out. And she ended up getting into a routine of going to preschool pickup and would, babysit if Cami needed to work a late night. And later on, Cami met a partner who she's now been with very seriously for a while, and they had a child together, and that child has special needs. Cami got really cut off from her other friendships. It was very hard for her when she was in and out of the hospital with her daughter to maintain those friendships, and people didn't necessarily want to be there for it. But Cami was at the hospital, and Cami really got to know her daughter. And when I visited Cami's home in Oklahoma, and Tilly had been staying there for a couple months, and I got to see how Tilly interacted with Cami's younger daughter, the child who has these, complex disabilities and has a lot of needs and can get uncomfortable easily. There was just this complete ease with Tilly scooping the girl up and like rocking her on a chair, or knowing what food she needed, or being able to kind of communicate with her. And that showed that there's so much trust and time that went into that relationship. Tilly also likes to use this word family, which is a portmanteau of friend and family. And there's a whole joke about like there's a family draft, like there's a draft in football or basketball or something that you could like try to get into somebody else's family, and that she campaigned to be part of this family. And, it's a running joke, but the kids understand it. And Tilly's caregiving of the kids is a big part of how she has shown up as a friend for Cammie.
At a whole other level is Linda and Natasha, who raised a child together. Can you tell us about them?
So Natasha had planned to raise a child on her own. She hadn't been in a romantic relationship in her mid-30s, thought she wasn't going to wait indefinitely or maybe forego the possibility of having a kid. So she ended up having a child on her own with an anonymous sperm donor. And her coworker and friend offered to be the birth coach once she found out that Natasha was pregnant. And she ended up going much further than being a birth coach. She completely fell in love with Natasha's son, Elan, described him as feeling like there was a magical little love bomb or something like she's very effusive. She really took to him. And, kind of similar to what I was describing with Tilly, got to know what Elan needed so quickly. And Elan, they later learned, had a series of complex disabilities. And Linda was able to soothe him when he was in a lot of distress. She sang to him and learned to sing on the in-breath, because if she paused to breathe, he would get really upset. Shows you how much she tended to him. She later sold her house to move into the same condo building as Natasha. So they call each other vertical neighbors, and she became part of the daily routine of Natasha and Elan, and went to the doctor's appointments. There was a point where Linda's friends were asking her, like, is this a wise thing to do? You have no rights to this child. What if anything happens to Natasha? And Linda herself was thinking about wanting to have a child on her own, and eventually realized, yes, she wanted to be a mother, but she wanted to be a mother to Elan. And so she and Natasha worked to get Linda legal recognition, which they were able to do. And they created precedent in Canada where they live. But it was not a kind of straightforward process because they're not romantic partners. And the law there and in other countries too really assumes that the parent of a child is going to have a relationship with the other parent, that there's going to be a romantic relationship between the parents, rather than exclusively looking at, well, what is the relationship between the adult and the child? They have really functioned as a family. Linda ended up in a romantic relationship with an acquaintance of Natasha's, so they've had a 3-parent family. And then as of a few months ago, Linda's partner gave birth to a child, so now Elan is an older brother. So they have 2 children and this 3-parent family.
Is there precedent for this kind of friendship and recognition of friendship historically or in other cultures? I know there'll be people listening to us speak who've never experienced a friendship like this, but might recognize it in other people that they've known. And there'll be people who have experienced friendships like this. What's the precedent for it?
There's vast historical precedent for very close friendships. And in fact, historically speaking, we are kind of the odd ones for not recognizing that friendship can be as devoted and intense as some of the friendships that I'm describing. So I mentioned earlier that one way that Em and I would talk about each other is as having a romantic friendship. So that is a kind of very intimate same-sex friendship that was common throughout the West in the 1700s, 1800s, up until the turn of the 20th century. It's kind of extraordinary to read letters, maybe especially between men, because it's so out of step with how we think about what is appropriate for men's communication with each other. They would write to each other in what looks like love letters, but there were, very different norms around what was okay to express to a friend at the time. So, one letter that I'm thinking of, this man was talking about his heart, which was physically weak, and that he said that his last pulsations shall vibrate for you. That's kind of a strong sentiment to have for a friend, but women exchanged locks of hair. At women's colleges, there was a term to describe 2 women who became attached at the hip, and they were called smashed. In the UK, it would be called having a rave. I can give other examples too of ceremonies, that are back almost 1,000 years where monks would pair off and be spiritually devoted to each other. And then there were later ceremonies that were built off of that were enacted in churches. So there were public ceremonies to commemorate friendship. We've just had a lot of history where friendship has meant a lot more. And I can talk a little bit about like why that's not the case anymore.
Why do you think it's not?
There are really kind of two trends or changes that I would put my finger on. One is that very close friendship no longer became innocent once you have the introduction of homosexuality as this identity and a stigmatized identity. So, we take for granted that we like know that a person is gay or lesbian or bisexual, but those were not identities that existed in a way that people understood until about the turn of the 20th century. So there was a lot more latitude to have physical and emotional intimacy and have it not be read as sexual. That's one of the two trends, the rise of this identity of homosexuality and the stigma attached to it that really took away the innocence from emotional and physical intimacy among friends. You could look up photos also from the late 1800s, early 1900s of men in studio portraits together where their arms wrapped around each other or their legs, on top of each other. They were just really intertwined and nobody thought anything of it there. The other trend is the growing space that marriage took up and meaning marriage took up in people's lives. Marriage was pragmatic, as we talked about, and it became a relationship where people expected love. And then in the last 60, 70 years, self-actualization. They expect, as Eli Finkel, who's a psychologist, has put it, that your romantic partner is supposed to be Michelangelo to your marble. Like they're supposed to unlock the best version of you that's within. And that is a really tall order and requires a level of time and investment and emotional connection that wasn't there before, and also probably leaves less space for other kinds of close connections in your life if you're expecting a romantic partner to fulfill so much. So both of those together, you can see this decline in what friendship has meant and what we expect of it.
We haven't talked about the worst part of friendship, and that is when they end. The end of a friendship, whether it's abrupt or slow, can be absolutely devastating. And that's what happened to Rhaina. Stay with us. When something burns very bright and very strong, when it starts to fade, the results can be devastating. Can you tell me a little bit about how your relationship with Em changed, how long you'd been together, and when you noticed that maybe things were evolving?
So Em moved abroad to a different continent for grad school, and we had kind of talked before she left about how we would maintain the friendship, but I didn't quite anticipate how things would change. It felt like the physical distance also became emotional distance, and the way that I felt like she constantly wanted to know everything about me, that we couldn't exhaust each other, we could leave endless voice memos, no longer really felt true. I felt more like an intrusion. And part of that was like she wanted to build a new life in a new place, which is very understandable. I don't think it was about me in particular. She would also spend a lot of time away from her phone. It was hard for me to accept how much I felt loss. I thought I was maybe being unreasonable. I didn't really know how to talk about it with other people because I didn't know many other people who had this kind of friendship. I was also writing and thinking about friendship at the time, and it felt like it kind of like undermined what I was saying if my own friendship was not at the level that it once was. I think the other difficulty was that it wasn't like there was some on-off switch where we went from being extraordinarily close, like partner level, to having some big blow up and then never seeing each other again. It was a scaling back of how close we were. And I would later learn that there is a term for this kind of loss that doesn't have a clear break, and it's called ambiguous loss. And it is characteristically very, very hard to deal with that kind of loss because it's difficult for the person who's experiencing the loss to recognize it because there isn't a kind of clear end. And it also makes it difficult for people to be supportive of the person who's experiencing the loss because they don't really see that there has been, a change. So, I think the time when it became clearest was when Em came back to visit DC, and I decided to tell her how I was feeling and that I was feeling less closeness, and kind of expected her to want to change things. And that was not really her response. It was like, what we had was beautiful and I think we're in a different phase. That was maybe when things got clearest, but it kind of took writing the book and particularly the parts about our friendship changing and doing that years after all of this to fully process what had been difficult and also to exchange what I had written with her and get her response about what she had been thinking and had not been able to articulate at the time, how much I had not been able to understand.
Did that conversation feel like a breakup?
No, I don't. We were on the couch and she was just, flat on top of me. It was very sweet and affectionate and caring. I mean, maybe this is still a reflection of what is the language when it is a scaling down, because it wasn't a breakup, but there was something that felt more final or clarifying about there was a break from our past that she had acknowledged and that I now needed to come to terms with. I mean, I don't really remember afterwards how I dealt with it. It was years ago, so I don't totally remember. But
what's your friendship like today?
I mean, Em is still one of the closest people in my life. I wouldn't use the same kind of language to describe the commitment. I think there's still a lot of the excitement and enthusiasm, and I want as much of her thinking and brilliance in my mind to seep into my head as possible. One big change is that our friendship is now mostly a three-way friendship with an Australian friend. That has been really interesting to see how two of us will react differently to the same thing and how much I feel like I have learned about Em through our mutual friend and other ways that we can relate to each other. But I kind of describe this as, instead of an on-off switch, sort of like a dimmer that it can move up and down. And that's been something that's happened, especially there have been points where our professional lives have converged more, or we want to do more co-writing together. And then that becomes a space to be checking in with each other out throughout the day and learning about what projects we're working on. And we're just sort of more integrated into life, but we don't live in the same city anymore. And we haven't for many years at this point. And so I think that just sort of makes it fundamentally different, because without proximity, it's hard to be as involved in each other's lives as we were, describing earlier. It's one of the benefits of kids' friendships so much is that proximity. So she's both one of the very closest people in my life, but it is also a different kind of relationship than what it had been when we started off in the first couple of years.
It's interesting you talk about that dimmer switch, and I know exactly what you mean. You had that sort of clarifying conversation, which almost drew to a close one season of your friendship and began another, which was one that burned a little less brightly and that was perhaps a little less intense. For some people, though, who have these kinds of friendships, they end abruptly. It's more like a switch flicking off, either through death, through a misunderstanding or a falling out. When that happens, the people that you spoke to for the book, how does it affect them, and what are the different ways that friendships can end?
I've had so many people tell me that the end of a friendship is more devastating than the end of a romantic relationship. I think a big part of it is that there is no recognition of the legitimacy of the end of a friendship as a real loss. And, I talked about ambiguous loss earlier. That's one way to really suffer. Another is to have what's called disenfranchised grief. So there are some forms of loss that are understood to be devastating, like the loss of a child, of a spouse, of a parent. And friend is just not one of the things that's on that list. And so it would count as grief that is not recognized, that's not understood, that there aren't rituals for. One expert I talked to who coined the term disenfranchised grief made the observation that you're probably not going to be able to go find a Hallmark card that says, sorry, your friend died. You could probably find a card that says, I'm sorry, your pet died, your dog died, your cat died,
Some workplaces even offer pet bereavement leave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in contrast, one woman who I write about, she spent 6 years as one of the main caregivers for a friend that she calls her soulmate. After her friend died, she was not entitled to bereavement leave because she wasn't related by blood, marriage, or adoption, but she could have taken bereavement leave for an uncle she had never met when he died. So there are these categorical distinctions that we make between different types of relationships that might often be a good proxy for how close people are, but they aren't always. And when you have a very close friendship that ends, that's when these categorical distinctions really fail people and they aren't able to get the recognition that they want, which only prolongs and exacerbates the grief.
You spoke to one person who, when their friend was murdered, they listened to love songs
the cultural writer Hua Xu, who's one of the things he writes about is music. So he's a music critic, he knows very well. And this is actually taken from his beautiful memoir that he wrote about his friend that I believe won the Pulitzer. So you don't have to trust my judgment. But he listened to love songs because there weren't songs about platonic love that captured either the depth of feeling or the grief that he had. And he later found some songs in hip hop where there was some, music that spoke to kind of a ride or die type of friendship. But, I don't think things have actually changed that much because that was decades ago now. But, TV we discussed is in a better place with shows like Broad City, Sex and the City, Golden Girls, so on. But music, there's a real deficit of talking about both the highs and lows of friendship.
Do you think that something will change? Can you see things changing? This idea of, people talk about friends being their chosen family now, the importance of friendship. We know that all the studies show that women have better health outcomes in old age, depending more on whether they've got friends. That's even more important than whether they smoke or not. Do you think that society is starting to recognize friendship a little bit more?
I do think we are part of a moment, or maybe something that will surpass a moment and be a kind of wave of change. Part of this in the US is coming from the Surgeon General, who has declared a loneliness epidemic. And, in the UK, there's a ministry for loneliness. There's an understanding that there's an inadequate amount of social connection that a lot of people have. There are a number of books that either have just come out or about to come out about friendship, running the gamut from more literary works, novels. There's a novel called Significant Others that came out the week before mine. That's a novel about the dissolution of basically a platonic partnership. And there are self-help books that are trying to help people have conversations or navigate tricky situations in friendship that, there are a zillion books on this for romantic relationships, but not for friendship. I've been really heartened by the kinds of conversations I've gotten to have with people who could talk about anything on their podcasts and are choosing to talk about this. So, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from readers that they felt like they were seen, or that they could start conversations with friends that they wouldn't have otherwise, even if it's something as simple as articulating how much the friend means to them, how much they love the friend. I've heard of people moving across countries to live with a friend, start raising a child with a friend. So I'm hearing ways that people are tangibly changing their lives to center their life more around friendship, and that they have things that they can hand over to people in their lives to explain what friendship means to them when they might not have felt understood previously. I'm hopeful.
So much to think about in that episode. It's so funny, this idea of best friends. When you get older, it starts to sound a little bit juvenile. I like the idea of significant others and platonic life partners. All of that kind of language is really interesting. And through the book, I loved the way Rhaina talked about one of the guys who were friends. I think his name was Andrew. His mother, Lisa, at first thought that his friendship with Tolly meant that maybe they were gay and that they weren't ready to come out and be out about it. And then over the course of their friendship, over the years of their friendship, when she saw what it meant to both of them and how it enriched her son's life, she came to understand it. And it was interesting reading this book and hearing these stories and talking to Rhaina, because at times I really felt myself bristling. I don't know why. It was kind of confronting in a way that maybe you should organise your life around not a romantic partner, around a friendship, and prioritise them over a romantic partner. I found that really interesting. Even though I am not one of those people who says my husband is my best friend, I'm one of those people who says I don't think I could be married if it wasn't for my girlfriends, and I don't expect my husband to bring everything into my life. I think that's too much responsibility and too much pressure to put on one relationship and one person. Anyway, tell me what you think. Rhaina Cohen's book, The Significant Others, Reimagining Life with Friendship at the Centre, is so good. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. The executive producer of No Filter is Kimberley Braddish, with sound production by Leah Porges. They're superstars. I'm Mia Freedman, and I'm off to find a new best friend. No, that's not true. I've got lots of really good friends. I'm off to make a leaderboard to see who's at the top. Just kidding.